have been able to impose his own will on his new colleagues, but he had always had a knack for getting his way with Diocletian. And Diocletian was the only man in the empire who the other tetrarchs would actually listen to. So, get Diocletian to ratify Galerius's will, and voila, a new order of things. With Maximian in hand, Galerius could now bill the meeting not as a desperate plea for Diocletian's gravitas, but instead as a summit of the original tetrarchs, minus the late Constantius of course, to reconsider the organization of the successor tetrarchy, which was, at present, a bloody mess. Diocletian, 3 years into his retirement, finally agreed to the meeting, and in November 308, traveled from his palace in modern Croatia to one of the military cities along the Danube River to meet with Galerius and Maximian. When the three emperors were once again in the same room, Maximian wasted no time begging Diocletian to come out of retirement so they could once again be the senior Augusti together. But Diocletian had no interest at all in returning to power, and allegedly told Maximian that if his old friend were to come see the magnificent cabbages he was now growing, that he too would turn his back on the pursuit of worldly power. It was agreed then that Diocletian would stay retired, and that Maximian, look at me Maximian, you are going to stay retired too. No more hopping down drunkenly from the stands to steal the ball from the kids. You got it? Galerius had to breathe a sigh of relief at Diocletian's response, as Diocletian coming out of retirement was the one scenario that would muck up his plan, which could now proceed as follows. Galerius would stay Augustus of the East, with Maximinus Daia as his Caesar. Constantine would be demoted back down to Caesar despite his self-proclaimed promotion to Augustus. Instead, a newcomer, and of course, old friend of Galerius's, Gaius Valerius Licinianus Licinius, would be vaulted directly into the role of Augustus of the West. Maxentius holding Rome and Alexander holding Carthage would both be declared illegal usurpers. The bargain struck, and Diocletian returned to his happy retirement, Maximian to his unhappy retirement, and Galerius to his role as senior Augustus of a newly minted tetrarchy. Himself, Licinius, Maximinus Daia, and Constantine. It had Diocletian's seal of approval. What could possibly go wrong? To say that this was a pretty crappy reorganization of the Tetrarchy is a bit of an understatement. As soon as the other principals were informed of the Little Committee's decision, there were at least 3 men wielding large armies who were instantly ticked off. Maxentius, because he had been snubbed yet again, Constantine, because they were trying to bust him back to Caesar, and Maximinus Daia, because he was still just a Caesar, while Licinius, the noob of the bunch, suddenly outranked him. How Galerius, who was clearly the driving force behind this realignment, thought that this quote-unquote compromise was going to work is a mystery to everyone. But there it was. Before I move on, I should probably do the thing where I give you a little thumbnail sketch of Licinius's pre-imperial life, especially since the newest member of the Tetrarchy will also prove to be one of its longest-serving members, and in the end, the final match of the championship round will be fought between him and Constantine. The new Augustus, like every other emperor of his age, was born to peasant stock, Dacian peasant stock to be exact, in the mid-260 AD, and he was raised in the rough border province of Moesia. Being about the same age and being from about the same place, Licinius and Galerius had apparently hooked up with each other at a young age and become fast friends. Star rose, Licinius rose with him, and he served alongside his old friend during the wars in Persia in the late 290s AD. After that, he appears to have served on Galerius' staff as a highly trusted advisor. So trusted that it was Licinius who was left in charge of the Danube frontier when Galerius left for Italy to confront Maxentius. And then so trusted that when a new Augustus needed to be appointed, Galerius pushed for his old friend Licinius. When Diocletian, for whatever reason, gave his blessing, Licinius was elevated to the purple in 308, and despite the fact that his presence in the Imperial College was annoying as all get out to everyone but Galerius, he managed to deftly maneuver around the myriad political landmines of the early 4th century, and he hung around for a surprising 16 years before finally being blown up by Constantine in 324 AD. As I just hinted though, the settlement hashed out between Galerius, Diocletian, and Maximian ultimately created more problems than it solved. Maximinus Daia had so far been the most stable part of the Tetrarchy, but now he became embittered at having been passed over for promotion. Out in the west, Constantine simply ignored his demotion back to Caesar, and instead went right on calling himself Augustus, something that caused acute embarrassment to the rest of the Tetrarchy, as there was really very little they could do to stop Constantine from calling himself whatever he wanted. Realizing that he had miscalculated a bit, Galerius attempted to soothe both of their egos by giving the two Caesars the further title, Sons of Augustus. But the transparent sop was seen for what it was by both. In the east, the unmollified Maximinus Daia would choose to follow Constantine's lead instead, and began to simply assert his own promotion to Augustus by 310 AD. And in the west, well, Constantine never stopped calling himself Augustus, even for a minute. The wild card following the settlement of 308 was Maxentius, still in control of Italy and still lacking any sort of legitimacy. Licinius' first mission on behalf of the Tetrarchy was supposed to have been bring Italy and Africa back into their hands, but as Severus and Galerius had demonstrated, that was easier said than done, and the new Western Augustus never would initiate a concentrated effort to oust Maxentius from Rome. That effort, as we will see next week, will be undertaken instead by Constantine, leading to one of the most famous and most important battles in the whole long history of the world, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The other wild card in all this, the really wild card at this point, was Maximian. Pushed back into retirement, despised by Galerius and Maximinus Daia, and obviously on the outs with his own son, the only imperial court that would accept the old man was his new son-in-law Constantine's, settled at that point in Britain. At first, Constantine was only too happy to secure for himself the further prestige of having the old Augustus around, but it did not take long for Maximian to chafe under the weight of his own impotence and cause trouble. Trouble that will lead the once noble Maximian to a most ignoble end. Things were pretty quiet for the first year or so, as Constantine continued to tour his provinces and campaign periodically against the Germans. But in 310, as Constantine began a more strenuous little war against the Franks, Maximian seized what he thought looked a lot like an opportunity, though it would turn out to be nothing of the kind. Constantine had dispatched his father-in-law to southern Gaul with a contingent of troops to keep an eye on the Alpine passes and make sure Maxentius stayed in Italy while Constantine fought the Franks. But instead of remaining on guard duty, Maximian decided, sort of out of the blue, hey, I think I want to be the senior Western Emperor again. So he spread the word that Constantine had died in battle, and further declared that he was an Augustus again. But the world had already moved on. In a replay of his confrontation with Maxentius 2 years earlier, Maximian discovered that whatever his past exploits, a new generation of emperors now commanded the loyalty of the troops. The soldiers under his command balked at following Maximian, and instead decided to wait for independent confirmation that Constantine really was dead. When it became obvious that Constantine was really not dead, and that having heard of Maximian's little ruse, he was now marching south with all deliberate speed, Maximian attempted to bribe the troops into following him, but they weren't having it. To follow Maximian would be to die with Maximian. Of that, they had no doubt. So Maximian headed to Marseille, which was both defensible and housed some troops who still remembered their old commander fondly. But these men were by far a minority in the city. Constantine had been more or less in charge of Britain and Gaul for the last 4 years, and in that time, he had made a hugely positive impact on everyone, soldier and civilian alike. He was attentive to the needs of the citizens, undertook rebuilding projects after years of neglect, promoted the arts, and was generally seen as productive, responsive, and wise beyond his years. There was no way anyone was going to abandon him for the old man Maximian. So, I'm not sure how many hours passed from the time Constantine showed up at Marseille to the time that the back door was opened for him by a loyal subject inside the city, but it seems like it was probably somewhere in the single digits. Maximian was tracked down and captured, and then hauled before an extremely irate Constantine. Constantine explained to Maximian that out of filial duty, he was not just going to kill his father-in-law, as he would any other rebel. But if Maximian were to, say, take this opportunity to save everyone future headaches by, do not at all be adverse to that. At some point in July of 310, Maximian did the right thing and hanged himself. He was about 60 years old, and not so very long ago, had been a successful emperor for 20 years. But now, rather than dying a hero to the empire, he died instead a broken disgrace. It was a sad end. Sure, without Diocletian, Maximian was a complete disaster. But up until the very end, he did have Diocletian. And so for most of his life, he was not a complete disaster. And though he died a hated man, he would sort of get the last laugh genetically, as it would be his grandsons and his great-grandsons who would eventually come to rule the empire following the reign of Constantine. The most immediate impact of Maximian's death was that it drove a wedge between Maxentius and Constantine. Up until now, the two had coexisted more or less peacefully, and the shared link of Fausta, Maxentius' sister and Constantine's wife, helped secure the peace. But after Maximian's death, things began to get ugly. We have no way of knowing whether the story is true, but not long after Maximian hanged himself, Constantine began passing it around that his father-in-law's suicide had nothing to do with the little rebellion Maximian had cooked up, and instead had everything to do with Maximian plotting to kill Constantine, despite having been so generously allowed to live. The key plot twist of this story was that Maximian had taken Fausta into his confidence, and that she had decided to betray her father to her husband, which cannot have gone over too well with her brother, even if he and his father were estranged. Constantine then went further and announced that Maximian's memory was henceforth damned. Throughout his provinces that had once been Maximian's, Constantine tore down statues and defaced monuments, crossing out any reference to or mention of the old Augustus. It appears that this was then picked up by the Eastern Tetrarchs, neither of whom liked Maximian one bit.